You push open a glass door. A little bell rings above your head. The smell hits you first. It is a specific kind of smell, one you could never quite describe to someone who had not experienced it themselves. Model glue, balsa wood, the faint ghost of paint thinner, and underneath all of it, something like old cardboard and possibility. The store is narrow and a little dim. Glass cases line the walls. Pegboard hooks hold plastic bags of tiny wheels, brass fittings, coils of wire. On a shelf near the back, a half-finished model ship sits on a workbench as if the owner just stepped away. Behind the counter, an older man looks up from what he was reading. He does not rush you. He just nods and goes back to his magazine and lets you look. That was the American hobby shop, and for most people alive today who remember it, that memory is one they carry quietly, like a stone in a coat pocket, small, smooth, and still there. Most of these stores are gone now. The ones that survived into the 2000s were already fighting a battle they could not win. The internet, the big box retailers, the slow collapse of leisure culture as Americans once lived it. All of that came together in a way that left very little room for a small, specialized store run by one or two people who simply loved what they sold. But the full story of how that happened goes back much further than the internet. It goes back to the middle of the 20th century, when the hobby shop was not a curiosity or a specialty retailer. It was a fixture of everyday American life. The hobby shop in its golden form existed roughly between the end of the Second World War and the early 1980s. That window, those 3.5 decades, represents something very specific in American domestic history. Men had come home from the war with mechanical skills and restless hands. Manufacturing was booming. Plastics were cheap, new, and being shaped into everything imaginable. The American middle class was expanding rapidly into freshly built suburbs, and those suburbs came with basements, garages, spare rooms, space for things that had no practical purpose except to occupy the mind and the hands during leisure hours. Hobby shops served that world directly. They were not large stores. Most of them occupied a single retail space, a strip mall unit, a downtown storefront, occasionally a converted house. You could find one in almost any town of moderate size across the country. In larger cities, there might be several, each with its own specialty. One shop might focus on model trains, another on radio-controlled aircraft, another on plastic model kits, slot car sets, model rocketry, balsa wood aircraft, military dioramas, stamps, coins, or some combination of all of it. The hobby shop was, in its essence, a place that took the interior life of a specific kind of person seriously. The man behind the counter was rarely just a merchant. He was an enthusiast. He had opinions about the accuracy of different model kit manufacturers. He knew the difference between enamel and lacquer paints and when to use each. He could tell you which cement dried cleanest on plastic. He had likely built dozens or even hundreds of the kits he sold. And if you asked him something he did not know, he would make it his business to find out. This was not customer service as a performance. This was simply the way of someone who had organized his working life around something he loved. For a certain kind of boy growing up in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the hobby shop was a destination with an almost sacred quality to it. A Saturday afternoon trip there, perhaps with a father or an uncle, perhaps alone on a bicycle, was an event. You might save your allowance for weeks for a particular model kit, a B-17 bomber, a 1932 Ford Deuce Coupe, a cutaway model of the human heart. The purchase was deliberate and considered in a way that most shopping today simply isn't. You studied the box art, you weighed your options, you felt the weight of the box in your hands. Fathers and sons built together in those basement workshops, and those hours had little to do with the models themselves. They had everything to do with time shared at a workbench,
with the quiet of a focused afternoon, with learning how to be patient with your hands and careful with small things. The hobby shop was the supply chain for a domestic ritual that crossed generations. But the forces that would eventually end the hobby shop era were already gathering even during its height. The business model of a specialty retailer had always depended on a few fragile conditions: a loyal local customer base, limited competition, and enough margin on the products to keep the lights on. Through the post-war decades, those conditions more or less held, but by the late 1970s, things were beginning to shift. The first pressure came from mass-market retailers. As chain hobby and toy stores emerged, stores like Hobby Lobby, Lionel Leisure City, and later the big box chains, they could purchase inventory in quantities that small independent shops simply could not match. Their prices dropped, their selection widened. The independent shop owner, who had been buying from the same distributors at the same prices for years, suddenly found himself unable to compete on cost alone. The second pressure came from the hobby itself, or rather from the slow decline of model building as a mass-market pastime. Television had been competing for the after-school and weekend hours of American children since the 1950s, but by the late 70s and early 80s, video games entered that same space and claimed it in a way that nothing before them had. A boy who might have spent a rainy Saturday gluing together a model destroyer now had an Atari in the living room. The market for plastic model kits and balsa wood aircraft began a slow contraction from which it never fully recovered. The 1990s were the decade when most of the remaining independent hobby shops began to close in earnest. Rising commercial rents, the arrival of large-format retailers, and a shrinking customer base left many shop owners in an impossible position. Some had operated their stores for 20 or 30 years. They had watched generations of boys grow up, come back with their own sons, and grow old. When they finally locked the door for the last time, it was often without any dramatic announcement, just a handwritten sign in the window, and a going out of business sale that felt more like a quiet dispersal than a celebration. The internet finished what the big box stores had begun. By the early 2000s, anything a hobby shop had ever stocked could be found online, usually cheaper, always with more variety. The last surviving independent stores gathered around the most committed hobbyists, often older men who preferred to shop in person and support a local institution on principle. A few of those stores still exist today, but they are rare and they know it. What we lost when the hobby shop disappeared was not simply a retail category. We lost a particular kind of place, a space that was neither home nor work, where a certain kind of knowledge was held and passed along casually, without ceremony. The man behind the counter, who could spend 45 minutes explaining how to correctly airbrush a model fuselage, was also, in a quieter way, a keeper of craft. He represented a chain of accumulated practical knowledge about materials, about patience, about the satisfaction of making something by hand that didn't need to exist, but did because you made it. There was something in the experience of the hobby shop that resisted the logic of efficiency. It was slow by design. It rewarded the person who lingered. It had no particular interest in your money beyond what was necessary to keep operating. What it was interested in was the thing you were trying to make and whether it would turn out well. That quality belongs to a world that moved at a different pace than this one. We can describe it, some of us can still remember it, but it is very difficult to reconstruct. If any of this brings back a memory for you, a particular store, a particular smell, a model you built on a kitchen table one winter, leave a comment below. Those details matter. They are the record of something real. If you're new here and stories like this one interest you, there are many more on this channel. A subscription keeps them coming. And as always, thank you for taking the time to listen.